Hello. We're back after a pause to pick up again with Class 12, The Rise of Constantine. I have not sent out a book list to you all this time around. It's very tempting. There's been a huge amount of work done on Constantine in the last 30, 40 years. There are a number of recent biographies of Constantine, and he's been treated in a number of studies of the early church. The study of the early church has gone through a real renaissance since the 1970s. And study of Constantine, because he relates directly to the relationship between the state and the church and what that ought to be, has been one of the many focuses of interest. So it would be very easy to write you a multi-page list. The difficulty would be stopping. But I decided not to do that. There are lists for further reading at the end of the book, and he has good titles listed. And I didn't want to just give you a book list to give you a book list. I don't always do that, and I don't have to. So I thought I wouldn't this time. Though I can't let it go without saying that a college classmate of mine, David Potter, who is now a very distinguished professor at the University of Michigan, wrote a biography of Constantine that's very good. I read it. David Potter is a very sane person. I've known him since 1975, and he was sane then, he's sane now, which is pretty good going these days. It's a lot of years in a row. So anyway, the Rise of Constantine chapter is really about two things. One, it's about the fact that the imperial ruling elite, which as the chapter begins you realize is no longer single. It's not a single person ruling, but rather a group. The tetrarchy, four people ruling. The imperial ruling elite becomes not only non-hostile to Christianity, but includes a Christian in it. And then when Constantine becomes the sole emperor of the empire, the imperial ruling elite is Christian. And that is an epoch-making change in the Western world. We will see that a much later relative of Constantine goes back to paganism. It's not, he only lasts 2 years, but still it's not a permanent, complete break. I should say, by parenthesis, I used to teach a class on the rise of Christianity in Asia, which is a very interesting topic. And one of the great puzzles of history, and one of the great puzzles of those who think about providence, God's providence in and for the world, is the question of why Asia never saw a Constantinian figure. There were a number of moments in the history of Asia where the entirety of Asia might have gone over to the church the way that the Roman Empire began to do under Constantine, if only there had been a ruler who identified with the church and pushed it along. One of the most prominent ones is Kublai Khan, and it never happened. And that's a theological as well as historical puzzle that I continue to ponder. Western Christians are not very much aware of this fact, but it's a true fact. And we would understand our own church history better if we knew more about the church history of the church outside the Roman Empire, which is going along great guns during the time that we are looking at the history of the early church inside the Roman Empire. There, just as a note, because we don't really get to talk about this, but it seems most probable, and this is a period for which there are no statistics, but it seems most probable that there was never a time before about the year, you could say 1400 or 1450. Some people would go as late as 1500. Some people would go as early as 1300. There is never a moment in which there are more Christians west of Jerusalem than there are east of Jerusalem. And that is something really worth thinking about. We imagine historically the church, for example, we imagine Christianity being a Western religion, and it's not. We imagine Christianity being a European religion, and it's not. We imagine Christianity being a Latin-based religion, and it's not, and never has been. All of those things are wrong. We imagine Roman Catholicism, the part of the church which is centered on Rome, as being a Latin-speaking entity, and it never has been. That's never true. There are always people centered on Rome who are not speaking Latin and not doing their worship in Latin and things like that. That's a whole nother topic that we could talk about sometime. Unfortunately, this class does not allow it. But it's very important for you to realize, just in passing, that most of the things that everybody thinks they know, settled history, we're like, people like to talk about settled science, which is a contradiction in terms, by the way. As the son of a scientist, I can say there's no such thing as settled science. But settled history that people think they know is wrong. It's all wrong. So anyway, we begin in a way with the consideration of Constantine. We begin a moment in the life of the church in which the separation of the church in the West, which at this point is really the entire Roman Empire, from the church elsewhere. The church already exists south of the Roman Empire in Ethiopia and beyond, and the church already exists east of the Roman Empire in Parthia, Persia and beyond, in India and so forth. The separation of the church in the West from the rest begins apace and continues at a great rate. So that's one of the things to keep in your mind. Hall will never talk about this because that's not his topic. There are histories of the entire church that do exist. Perhaps at the end of the class I'll send you a little reading list. If you want to know church history as it actually happened rather than church history as we imagine it, I can send you a list of, there are 1-volume histories that treat with that. Writing a 1-volume history of the entire church is like writing a 1-page history of Western civilization. You don't cover much, but it's I know some people who've done it. It's certainly possible to do it. Anyone can do it who wants to. And it's a useful thing, actually, to do, because there are very useful things you can do with that in teaching at the college and seminary level. At the same time that every class you leave everything out. So, that's not a particularity of this topic. But anyway, when we think about the rise of Constantine, it's a very brief chapter, and you might be puzzled. We have quite a lot of original documents that we're going to look at. And the reason why we're looking at so many original documents and why the chapter is so short is that the topic is so large that it's necessary for Hall to boil it down to the point of disappearing in order to just cover it. And I wanted to give you a lot of primary material because I wanted to show you every writing shows you one or two particular aspects of what's going on. So before we even begin talking very briefly about the Hall and then going on to look at the original stuff, let me say a few things. The first is, one of the reasons why there is so much writing and interest in Constantine is that Constantine is clearly a tremendously important figure in the development of Western Christianity. But he is a figure that we always get secondhand. We have tremendous sources for Constantine. I mean, Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea in Palestine, knew Constantine. He wrote a life of Constantine himself. So we have at least partially eyewitness life of Constantine. There are letters of Constantine that survive, some, not as many as we would like, of course. We have a lot of different people writing about him, but of course, because Constantine is such a pivotal figure, even in the ancient period during his life and after, everybody's got an axe to grind with Constantine. There's nobody who's just looking at him and thinking, what an interesting man, I'll write about him. Everybody's writing about him to make a point. And their points are always of a kind that would sort of aim Constantine in a particular direction. There actually has been a biography of Constantine written in the last 20 years or so that tries to argue that, well, the primary question everybody wants to know about Constantine vis-a-vis the church is Constantine really a Christian by conviction, or is Constantine a politician who sees in the church a useful group that he can make use of in order to more fully control the empire? And that, on a certain level, that question has to be unknowable, because no matter what anyone does, Pope Benedict, is it Benedict now? No, Benedict was Pope. Anyway, the current Pope, Francis, is it Francis? Anyway, the Pope we have now, from South America, whom everyone thinks is such a wonderful, touchy-feely guy, who has a great sense of the poor and everything. Even now, you could write an argument saying he doesn't actually believe any of this stuff. It's all an act. He's just doing this because he wants people to approve of him. And what he really thinks is something completely different. And on a certain level, an argument like that is unanswerable, because you can't look inside someone's heart. You can't know why anyone is doing anything. And so, since that's true of someone who's still alive and whom you can ask, but of course if you ask him, Holy Father, do you believe the creed? I expect that he would say yes, and then he would say, ha, see, it proves it. He's faking it because of course he doesn't believe the creed and he's lying. And the other people would say, yes, of course he believes the creed. See, he said he did. So, who's right? No one can know. It has been argued that the traditional story is that Constantine is raised by a Christian mother, Helen, who is a good Christian example to him. And so then as an adult, when he is, granted a vision by God before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, that he is, prepared, he is pre-evangelized by his mother's example. And so he recognizes the Christian symbol, and he becomes a Christian and lives the rest of his life as one. People have argued recently that Helen was actually not a Christian and that Constantine became a Christian and converted his mother. The fact that you can argue that from the historical sources shows how skimpy and how scattered the historical sources are. I've read the book that argued that. It's interesting. I've never found anyone other than the author who was convinced by it, but what does that say? I think the traditional historical picture of Constantine is probably right as we can know. And we need to we need to treat Constantine as a historical figure based on what we know about what he did and said. That said, let me say a few things about Hall, and then we'll go and look at the original sources. To begin with, the Tetrarchy, Diocletian, who gets a very bad rap from the Christians because of the persecution, in political and civil terms was a tremendously successful emperor and really, in certain ways, saved the Roman Empire from dissolution. One of the things he realized was that the Roman Empire was under stress from so many different directions at the same time that it was necessary for there to be multiple imperial individuals functioning. Because there were military problems all over the empire, there needed to be armies to deal with them. And the problem as the Roman Empire went on was that armies tended to crown their commanders, and then you would have rival emperors fighting each other. And so one of the things Diocletian tried to do is by pre-crowning all of these major military figures, they wouldn't have to fight with each other for the crown. There would be a system whereby both East and West, sort of roughly speaking Latin and Greek parts, would have a senior emperor called an Augustus and a junior emperor called a Caesar. And when the Augustus died or retired, Diocletian retired, which is an amazing thing. When when the Augustus was no longer there ruling, then the Caesar would step up and he himself would appoint a Caesar to be his assistant. That way the junior people would be attached to the senior people because they would have been appointed by them, and there would be a stability because there could be 4 different imperial centers, 4 different independent military structures dealing with the troubles of the empire. It says a lot for us to know that Constantine was born apparently in York in northern Britain, because that was one of the trouble areas in the empire, and his father was military commander up there. It's possible that his mother, who has a Greek name, Helen, it's possible that she was British. Lots of things are possible. We don't know, but and it's a very different political period in the Roman situation. It does seem, we said before when we talked about the Decian persecution, that the Decian persecution seems, as far as we can tell now, not to have been actually aimed at the Christian church, but rather to have been a government program intended to garner the favor of the pagan gods for the empire, in direct contradistinction, as people like to say. The Diocletianic persecution does seem to have been directly aimed at the church. So alone among general persecutions in the Roman Empire, this was actually a persecution of the Christian church rather than a government program in which the church got caught up and crunched. Because of this, the church has generally not liked Diocletian, which is understandable. Diocletian was from what we used to call Yugoslavia. He retired to the coast of what's now Croatia in Split, and near the old Roman city of Salona, the ruins of which are very interesting. And you can go see his palace that he built to retire to, which was also his tomb. His tomb was in the middle of it, which is now the cathedral in Split, his tomb. It's a very interesting place to go see. It's quite small. I've been there twice. It's quite small, and it's also clearly a castle. It's not a luxury villa in the countryside the way Hadrian built himself outside of Rome. And so that tells us 2 things. One is that the Roman Empire, in important ways, in the early 300s, was a lot poorer than it had been before, because it's not, for someone who had been the emperor of the Roman emperor, it's not a big place. And it's a lot bigger than my house, but I'm not ruling the known world. And also, it's clearly a defensive structure. It's a military structure, and the fact that on the coast, in the middle of the empire, the retiring military commander built himself a fort to live in tells you everything about how he thought the Roman imperial military was doing generally, which is not very well. Those are very important facts to keep in mind, I think. So one of the things that the Tetrarchy development shows us is that the practical situation of the Roman Empire had changed drastically, and the only thing that was going to keep it going was to drastically change the governmental structure. And that's what Diocletian did. As a result of the actual persecution, purposeful persecution of the church suffered splits again the way it did after the Decianic persecution in the 250s. Donatism, the split that survived until the Muslims swept the church away in North Africa, is by far the most impressive, well-known, and worth-knowing result of this persecution. It is important to know that, again, there are no statistics and people fight about everything, but it does seem likely that once Donatism had developed in North Africa, and now I'm being very careful here, once Donatism had developed in North Africa, that never again were what we would call Catholic Christians the majority in the church in North Africa, it seems likely that the Donatists were always the majority. Things did change over time. The Roman government got involved, as we will see, but it does not seem that even with the might of the Roman army, that the Catholic Church was ever able to drive people out of the Donatist church back into the Catholic Church. And that's very interesting because North Africa was by far the most heavily Christianized part of the Roman Empire, as far as we can tell. That's where the largest proportion of the population was Christian. So it's very interesting that the place where the society became the most Christianized was also, as far as we know, where the church was most deeply split. I don't know exactly what to make of that. No one else does either, but it's something worth thinking about. It's very difficult to put a history of Donatism together because, of course, we hear about everything from one side, not another. W.H.C. Friend's book, The Donatist Church, Oxford, 1952, which was actually his doctoral thesis, the original of which, original typescript of which I have seen in the Theological Library in Oxford. People used to take it out and look at it as a great artifact. It's probably the greatest doctoral dissertation ever written in the field of the early church. Anyway, if we'd had candles, we would have lit them in front of it. He was a very nice man, as well as a greatly learned man. And his book is still the standard. It's actually back in print again. You can get it. If you're interested in Donatism, that's certainly the place to begin. He had done a lot of archaeology in North Africa before the Second World War. And then the Second World War came, and so his dissertation was delayed by about 15 years because of the Second World War. Pretty much no one's been able to do archaeology since the Second World War, so his stuff is still the most up-to-date there is. There was briefly, before the Muslim Spring, some hope that archaeology was going to start up again in the Muslim world. The Muslim Spring has made certain that not only does there not seem to be, if I have 35 more years left, which would be good going, I'd be older than my father, I probably won't live long enough to see archaeology in the Muslim world. And so not only will there not be new discoveries, but they're destroying all the stuff that's already known. So we'll all be looking at photographs from the 1910s, probably forever. Okay. One of the things to keep in mind, to notice before we start looking at particulars, is that as soon as Constantine declares toleration for Christianity, which is the Edict of Milan, which actually kind of survives, which is remarkable. More about that when we get there. Once Constantine publicly associates himself with Christianity by declaring toleration for Christians, not that Christianity is the faith of the empire, that's not what happens then, but toleration, and it becomes quite well known because he puts Christian symbols on the standards of the legions, things like that he is associating himself with Christianity, though Constantine is not baptized until his deathbed. Then immediately the church goes to him and wants the imperial government to settle its internal quarrels, and the government gets caught up in all of the different troubles that beset the early church. It is worth knowing that, for those of us who live in a culture where we like to think church and state are always separate, that's a whole other conversation about what that means in the U.S. But it's perfectly clear historically that the government does not force its way into the church in the Roman Empire. The church drags the government into its problems willy-nilly. The government's trying to stay out. No, we don't want to get messed up with all of your interminable problems. And the church insists that the government get dragged in. And I'm a big independence of the church person. But I think it's a great example of the fact that once you let the bear in your house, then the bear owns your house, not you. And that's pretty much been one of the problems with the history of the church ever since, that the bear has owned the house. There, in a nutshell, is my ecclesiology as far as church and state go. So let's begin and look at these different readings. We're beginning with number 239, which is on page 308. This is our next to last class with the new Eusebius. After that, we're going to Creeds, Councils, and Controversies, so that'll be exciting. More theological, less historical, or more theological to go with our history. So let's look at this. This is Eusebius, the church historian's record of the sort of announcement of the persecution. We don't have a particular announcement of the persecution. We kind of do. Okay. It was the 19th year of the reign of Diocletian, and the month of Distress, or March, as the Romans would call it, Mars. After Mars, March is the month that armies go out to battle. That's why it's named after the war god, right? The festival of the Savior's Passion was coming on, so it was springtime, right? An imperial letter was everywhere promulgating, ordering the razing of the churches to the ground, the destruction by fire of the scriptures, proclaiming that all those who held high positions would lose all civil rights, while those in households, that seems to be those, just members, if they persisted in their profession of Christianity, would be deprived of their liberty. Not long after, we were further visited with other letters, and in them the order was given that the presidents of the churches, those who preside over the churches, that is, the bishops, and I guess if you had a parish church, it would be a presbyter, should all in every place be first committed to prison, and then afterwards compelled by every kind of device to sacrifice. If this is accurate, then this represents a clear attempt by people who know something about Christianity to try to make it impossible for the church to function. They are going to knock down church buildings. That, of course, is interesting because it indicates to us that the government thought that the church owned buildings, right? That they would burn the scriptures. It shows that the people writing this law in the government knew that having scriptures was necessary for Christian life, right? You can't really do the Eucharist without reading from the Bible. Why don't they have them burn the prayer books? There's a good question for your comprehensive exams. The answer is there aren't any prayer books yet, right? The only stuff they read at service is the scriptures. They can't burn service books because service books don't exist, but they can burn the Bible, and if your church has no Bible, you can't do a real service because you can't read a lesson. Okay. And that those who preside over the churches would be arrested, and then they would try to make them sacrifice. If your church is knocked down, and your Bibles are burned, and your bishop is in jail, you cannot function as a Christian entity. It's very clear that this is very different from the Decianic law, which said everybody has to go sacrifice to the gods, right, so that the gods will favor Rome. As far as the Roman government was concerned, they didn't care if all the Christians went and sacrificed and then went home and did Christianity, right? What they were trying to require was the sacrifice. Here, there's no out. They're specifically going after Christianity. It's a very different thing. Now we go to the next one, 240. This is tremendously interesting. Hand over your books. Action at Kirta, which is North Africa. People always say Sirta, but it's Kirta. Anyway. What's really interesting here is there seems to be, the mayor and some officials go to do what the imperial decree tells them to do, and they take along a scribe who takes down, like a court reporter who takes down a record of what everyone says. This should remind you of the fact that in the ancient period, there were shorthand systems for both Greek and Latin, and there were trained scribes who were able to take down human speech as quickly as people talk, so that we do have transcriptions of meetings. And this is actually a transcription of it's sort of half a hearing and half a, what would you call it, half a police raid, where they kick down the door and, ask for your stuff. So the mayor says to Paul, bring out the writings of the law and everything else you have here, according to the order. The bishop says, so first of all, notice the third line, they arrived at the house where the Christians used to meet. This does not specifically say that it's a house that the Christians owned, a specific building set aside for worship, but it is the place of worship. Okay? Anyway, the readers have the scriptures, but we will give what we have here, right? In this place, and as far as we know, in most places, the readers took the scriptures home. Most places did not have specific church buildings, and the readers who read the scrolls would take the scrolls home, partly because because people who could read knew how to take care of books, and partly one would think also so they could practice before the next service, reading the lesson that they were going to read. Anyway, point out the readers or send for them. And the bishop says, you all know them. The mayor says, I don't know them. And the bishop says, the municipal office knows them. That is the clerks, Edusius and Junius. So they're clerks. They may actually work in the municipal office, or their fellow clerks in this little city of Kirta. It shows you something of the social place of Christianity, that the readers in the church, who are important officials in the church at this point, are known to the local civil authorities and clearly not getting arrested, right? This shows that Christianity is not generally oppressed at this time. This order to go after the church is a real change in practice for the Roman imperial government. That's worth noticing. Okay, so then they get an inventory of church plate and other property, large stores of male and female clothes and shoes, which almost certainly kept in the place of worship to be handed out to the poor, right? They are alms in kind kept there. They have 3 priests. They have a bishop, 3 priests, 2 deacons, 4 subdeacons, a number of diggers who would have dug graves for Christians, and of course these readers. So, and then they go through, I would love to spend more time on this. They go through everything. One of the things to notice here is that the jobs are quite defined, right? Produce the scriptures you have, says the mayor, a third of the way down, page 310. And Marcuclius and Catalinus, the 2 subdeacons, say, we don't have any more. We're subdeacons. The readers have the books, right? Subdeacons have particular jobs, at least in this place. And it doesn't include reading. They're different people. Notice also that some people produce books without a struggle. Some people struggle. Some people don't produce books. There is a variety of responses to this problem. And also, as we will see in a moment, there is a variety of people thinking what the different responses mean. Okay, they produce one very large volume. That's a scroll. We don't know what's on it. Okay. I like the note of the reader's house that they go to, and he's out, but his wife is there, and she hands over the books. That's there's a lot to say about that, but that's in pre-marriage counseling. Anyway. Okay. The conversion of Constantine. Let's look at that, 249. So just as before we go on, as far as we can tell, the Christians in Kirta were not completely resisting, were semi-resisting. There's no theological reason for them to not hand over the clothes that are kept as alms. You want to keep them because you want to have alms, but it's not a theological disaster to not have any shoes to hand out to people if they're taken away. We are not told specifically exactly what the scrolls that they handed over are. I do think that makes a difference. As we will see, the early church thought it made some difference, not as much difference as I think. But we don't get a complete picture, but it's tremendously interesting to sort of watch the process go. It's a mixture of trying to be tough. The mayor's clerk is clearly trying to be tough, and treating them as people who are in trouble, but people they know. In other words, it's not like having the Gestapo come to your house quite. It's not a good thing, of course, but it's you have to sort of see what's happening. It's difficult to know, and of course we have to realize that we know nothing about how it went in almost every other place in the empire, and it makes sense to think that it would be different in every place, one place from another. Okay, the conversion of Constantine. You notice that even here we get two different views. The first is from Lactantius, The Death of the Persecutors, a Latin work, and Eusebius is the VC is the Vita Constantini, the Life of Constantine, and we get different presentations, right? The anniversary of Maxentius' accession, the 27th of October, was near. His first 5 years of rule were drawing to a close. Maxentius is the guy that Constantine's going to fight a battle with. Constantine was directed in a dream to mark the heavenly sign of God on the shields of his soldiers and thus to join battle. He did as he was ordered, and with the cross-shaped letter X with the top bent over, he marked Christ on the shields. Lactantius is in the west. He is a tutor to the imperial children, so he's around, of course, a lot of soldiers with whatever this thing was on their shields, for him to see, and he knew the individual people involved. So this is not a first-hand account. This is not Constantine saying what he did, but this is pretty close. Okay, it's interesting, as they show in the note here, that even saying a cross with the top bent over isn't enough information for you to actually know what the thing looked like. There are lots of different possibilities. And then after that you get Eusebius' Life of Constantine. There is much more emphasis on the religious nature of Constantine here, 28.1, near the top of 321. He besought his father's God in prayer, beseeching and imploring him to tell him who he was and to stretch out his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. It's interesting that it would be described as beseeching his father's God in prayer, his mother, as far as we know, being a Christian, and his father being a kind of non-sectarian monotheist. From the point of view of the church, at least as far as I'm concerned, I would be much happier if he were beseeching his mother's God in prayer. We don't know if this is a description that comes from Constantine's lips to Eusebius. We don't know if Constantine never said anything about this and Eusebius assumed that Constantine prayed. We don't know if Constantine said, I didn't pray, but Eusebius says he did anyway because he thinks it's appropriate, because after all he's a bishop and bishops like people to pray. We don't know any of those things. But it is interesting that you get a sort of more religious and less religious version of this story. Lactantius being also a very fervent Christian, it's not that he's not Christian that would make his story different. Okay, then let's, again, there's another hour in that, but we'll go to the next one, 250, the Edict of Milan. This is tremendously interesting because this is pretty close to the actual edict's text. This is Lactantius reporting this again, but this seems to be the edict in the letter form in which it was sent out to imperial governors in different provinces. When we, Constantine Augustus and Licinius Augustus, this is Constantine with the emperor now of the East, against whom he's going to eventually fight also, but he isn't yet. His sister marries Licinius, and one of Licinius's daughters marries one of his sons, I think. They get connected. had happily met at Milan, were conferring about all things. And notice here, beginning on the third line on page 322, our purpose is to grant both to the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each man has desired. It's very important to understand that there is a very strong distinction between the legalization of Christianity, this is the granting of toleration to Christianity, and the making of Christianity into the imperial religion. That comes much later. People argue about when that comes, when that's actually officially policy. It's even possible that it never becomes officially policy. It just slowly kind of slides into being the way things are. You can argue that, and people do. But certainly, Constantine does not make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. Just as a quick note, one of the things to realize here is that at the time that Constantine comes out of the closet, after the Milvian Bridge, after his vision, the church is very small as far as the empire is concerned. No one knows how many people lived in the Roman Empire. Experts' suggestions range from about 50 million to 100 million, which tells you that they're not necessarily worth all that much. No one knows how many people were in the church at that time. The best book for that I would suggest reading is The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark, which I think is in one of the further reading lists in Hall's book. He guesses by people who know what they're talking about range from about 1 million to 3 million people in the Roman Empire. So to take it from one extreme to the other, if there are 100 million people in the Roman Empire and there are 1 million Christians at the time that Constantine is doing this, then it's only 1% of the population, and so he's hardly backing a winning horse, right? If you break it down the other way and say it's 50 million people in the Roman Empire and the church is 3 times as big and is 3 million Christians, it's still only about 1 in 17, so it's still hardly a winning bet. 1 in 17 is like Trump voters in Washington, D.C. I wouldn't put a Trump sticker on my car because you don't want it to get vandalized. And I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not an anybody supporter. I'm not a member of either party. But in other words, 1 in 17 is not an appreciable part of the population. However you slice it, it seems clear that, to me, that someone as successful and politically astute as Constantine could not possibly have been doing this public relationship with Christianity for political reasons, because there are not enough Christians for that to make political sense. And the Christians there are, as far as we know, tended not to be important people, but rather to be unimportant people. And in a very strictly hierarchical society, if you have 1 in 17 of the least important people, that's much less influence than if you had 1 in 17, spread all the way through, which would still be almost nothing. But 1 in 17 of the bottom of the pyramid just doesn't do you any good at all. So it doesn't make much sense to think that Constantine is doing this for political reasons. Whatever else may be going on and we cannot know, as I've said, I just don't think that you can say, oh, Constantine is clearly a hypocrite and he's only doing this because it benefits him politically, because given what we know, there is just no way to imagine how this could possibly benefit him politically. It just doesn't seem to be possible. It's certainly not the case that the army is full of Christians. That's not true. We know that. Anyway, okay. So our next one is 258. You notice we begin to get canons in this. It would be so much fun to go through all these canons. We get canons in this day's selections of things. We get canons again from Cirta, Council of Cirta in Numidia. Numidia is the name of a particular Roman province. I think Numidia is mostly Morocco, but there may be a little bit of Numidia in Tunisia. It's, again, North Africa. Okay. And what do we see here? This is Augustine in a treatise that he writes against a prominent Donatist theologian, Cresconius, theologian and bishop. This is his passing on to us this meeting which happened at Cirta in 305, which is long before Augustine is born. This is in the, at the very beginning of Constantine's public Christian period. What you see here is an inquisition among the different bishops who were meeting here about who had fallen, lapsed, in the persecution and how they had fallen, and so how they should be treated, right? So it starts off, let us first of all see that all are duly qualified to act. Before we consecrate a bishop, which seems to be the purpose of the meeting, we have to decide who's still a bishop in a state of grace, as we would say, and so who is able to participate in the consecration ceremony. So Secundus says, it is alleged that you've been guilty of betrayal, and he says, that Florus searched for me, but God did not deliver me into his hands. Right? So I ran away and I didn't do it. Secundus says, if we let you go for running away, what are we going to do about the martyrs? Because they were, tortured and killed, and they didn't betray. So clearly, it's interesting. The first guy, Secundus, Donatus thinks, this is Donatus of, it doesn't tell us where Donatus is the bishop of. Anyway, Donatus is thinking that just running away in time of persecution is enough to make you, he doesn't like it, right? Donatus, so it's Donatus who ran away, and Secundus says, that's not good enough. So Secundus says, step on one side as kind of out of the running right now. And then Marinus says, I gave papers to Paulus, my codices are safe. That seems to mean I handed over maybe church records or just other stuff, but the codices, the actual Bible, I protected. That's not good enough. The fact that you acted as though you were going along disqualifies you. Donatus, another Donatus of Calama says, I gave them medical treatises. If soldiers show up at your house and say, hand over your scriptures, and you give them, I'm sitting in a room full of books. I could give them a new Eusebius, and they don't know what it is because they can't read. They're Roman soldiers. So they go off happily, and I protect my Bible. Why is that a bad thing? It's bad enough so that Secundus says, over there on one side. Anyway, we can't go through all of the details, but it's two things you notice. One is that there are a whole lot of different possibilities for what people might actually have done. And so the church has to think about what is the moral value or badness of all of these different possibilities. And they have to develop some kind of response to, what all these different things are going to mean. This is a tremendously messy process. We talked a little bit about this before. The Novatianists, who are the group that I am studying, who had begun after the Decian persecution 60 years before, are still around. They're going to survive, I think, into the late 700s, maybe early 800s at least. So these things have legs, right? In other words, the church didn't solve their earlier problem, and the church is not going to solve this problem either, in the sense that they're not going to come to a settlement that everyone thinks is just and is willing to buy into. It ends up as a mess. The next one, 259, the origin of Donatism. Some scholars take this with great seriousness as an actual record of what happened to spark the disputes. Other people say this is complete baloney, and this is just, the kind of, they would say romanticizing, but kind of turning into a nice story, the way things actually work. Again, we have absolutely no way to know, but all we know is what we're told. But if you look at this, there's some interesting things that are going on. To begin with, this is not a quarrel just among clergy. It's clear that the laity are heavily involved in this. That's worth knowing, first of all. This woman, Lucilla, who shows up at the Eucharist to receive communion and has a bone of a martyr, a relic of a martyr, and she goes up to receive communion, which is clearly what's happening, and she has her little bone. She takes out her relic and kisses it and then wants to receive communion, and the bishop doesn't want her to do that. It's not exactly certain why the bishop doesn't want her to do that. If he doesn't want her to be distracting people with her relic, if he doesn't like the person whose relic it is, if he doesn't like the woman, all of these things are possible and more besides. One thing it shows us is that there's, at least in Lucilla's case, there's tremendous religious devotion to the martyrs and their relics. That's one thing we see. Another thing we see is that the bishops are trying to sort of control devotional practice and keep order in the church. And we see clearly that there are people in North Africa who think that this is a way of dishonoring the relic, which is a way of dishonoring martyrs, which shows that you are not someone who is a supporter of martyrs, therefore you are a supporter of traditors who hand over stuff, so therefore you are yourself a lapsed person. And this is where the open break between the people who are going to be more rigorous and say, if you're a traditor or a lapsed person, you've got to really go out till the end of your life, and others who say, no, we're going to have this penitential system by which you can stay in and work your way out of it through prayer and fasting and hearing and things like that. It does make sense to think, this is just in the abstract, it does make sense to think in the abstract that there would have been a period during which people of various opinions would have stayed together, and that, in other words, that the break would not have been instant, in the same way that, if you know anything about the history of the falling apart of the Episcopal Church during my lifetime, and I guess really during my lifetime, I'm born in the 50s, you know that things don't happen immediately. There are delays and ripples, and human organizations don't break apart, instantly. There are delays and local peculiarities, and it makes sense to think that this is also going on. Optatus, who is a Catholic and doesn't like the Donatists, of course, is going to, be anti-Donatist. I myself am anti-Donatist. I'm a supporter of the Catholic tradition, but you have to read, in order to try to figure out what actually happened, you have to read his account with an awareness of the fact that you're not getting what a Donatist would consider a sort of fair telling of the story. Just quickly to note the canons of Ancyra in selection 272, beginning on page 354. Ancyra is the city which is now the capital of Turkey, called Ankara, and would have been called Ankyra in Greek in the old way. And we can't look at any of these in particular, but you notice that this is a clear demonstration of the fact that, and this is a long way away from North Africa, right? I mean, the church in Asia Minor has a very different history than the church in North Africa. So that problem of the rise of Donatism is a North African thing, but we're seeing that the same kind of mix-up that is going on in North Africa is clearly present also in Asia Minor, because they are trying to solve the same kind of array of problems and array of different groups of people who did different things. Um, all sorts of different possibilities for things that clergy might have done, and so things that the church might have to do about the clergy going forward. It's very important for us to understand the extreme messiness, disorganization, and confusion that are involved in all of this. Um, People often say, why does it take so long to sort this out? And the more you study the history of the church, the more you realize is that it takes a very long time, even nowadays with instant communication, it takes a very long time to figure out what's actually going on before you can begin to figure out what to do about it. And think how much more difficult that would have been in the ancient world, where one guy would get on a mule and try to get from Asia Minor to North Africa with word of what's going on there, and then you're supposed to take a reply back. The ships were quicker and they could only go part of the year, but it's very important to realize the practical difficulties involved in all of this are much more important than modern people often remember. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, if we look at Licinius, who is the guy we saw before, issuing the Edict of Toleration from Milan with Constantine, now, 14 years later, they're not getting along anymore. And so Licinius, now about to start a war with Constantine, or about to be involved in a war with Constantine, is going after Christians again in his eastern part of the Roman Empire for obvious reasons. Constantine not himself being a Christian, but having allied himself with Christians publicly. Licinius, now his political enemy, though still his relative family member by marriage, he's naturally going to think of Christians as his enemies, at least his potential enemies. And so that's what we see here. The first thing he does is drive Christians away from his palace. He doesn't want a Christian standing behind him at dinner where he might stick a knife in his neck when he's trying to eat his soup, right? That makes perfect sense. Of course, here you are getting a Christian's view of Licinius, the last Roman emperor to really actively persecute the Christian church. So you can imagine he's not going to get a positive press. Now we just have a few more to look at. The thing to really take away from this beginning of section 28, Constantine and the Christians, this comes from the end of what was originally the end of Eusebius's church history, though he did add on to it later. You want to realize how, for Eusebius and for Christians like him who thought that Constantine's, who had lived through the persecution and then saw Constantine coming, it really does seem to them as though the accession of Constantine, the legalization of Christianity, and the beginning to favor Christianity, at least personally, by the emperor, is an eschatological event, an event that heralds the working out of God's will in the world. This is perhaps the high point of Christians' view of their monarchs as God's, vicegerent on earth. And it makes perfect sense that they should think so. The fact that Christians to the east of the Roman Empire, who go back as far as Christians in the empire do, have had all of their 2,000 plus years of Christianity without ever having a government ignore them, let alone favor them. You can see how their ecclesiology, or their understanding of the relationship, the relationship between the church and the world would be very different. this certainly changed the Western Christian idea of the relationship between the church and the world tremendously. Okay. It is interesting to see here in 279 on page 362 that the Novatianists, who still continue, who are completely orthodox theologically but are rigorists along the lines of the Donatists, but seem to be small and scattered and not making political trouble, that Constantine is quite forgiving and benign toward them. He allows them to own their own church buildings, their own cemeteries, that they should be allowed to keep a hold of their property that they need to function as a group. In other words, not everyone is going to be forced to be members of the Catholic Church. And that's an important thing. The first Christian ruler of the Roman Empire is a ruler who allows for diversity among Christians. Even though he rules against the Donatists, he does not persecute the Donatists, and he does not persecute the Novatianists, who were already there too. And then the very last thing, 305, I just threw in because while we're talking about Constantine, you want to go all the way here. And 305 is Constantine famously saying that to the bishops, you are the bishops of the people in the church, I am the bishops of people outside the church. A comment that can be taken about 154 different ways. I could give you a different explanation every day of the week for a number of weeks. It seems clear, first of all, that Constantine is saying that the civil authority has its own realm in which the civil authority functions in parallel with the way that the bishops function. He's not ceding all power to the bishops, but he's also saying that there is a parallel between the way bishops look after Christians and the way the civil government ought to look after everybody. In other words, there's sort of the law-giving, judging, supervising part. It's interesting because one of the things this comment really says, I think, is that Constantine does have, on one level, an almost jurisdictional sense of the way the church works. That bishops have a kind of jurisdiction in the church which is legal and organizational, and that they have the right and duty to perform those functions in the same way that he has the right and the duty to perform imperial functions. And that says something about the way he thinks of the church. Constantine is a Latin speaker. He's a Western person. And maybe we can end with the idea that I think I've mentioned before, which is it seems perfectly clear that there is a level on which Latin Christians have always thought of the church in a much more legal, structural, jurisdictional way than Eastern or Oriental Christians ever have. The fact that we, for example, the fact that we're going to teach canon law in our summer session this summer is something which seems absolutely obvious to us, but it's very easy to imagine an Eastern Orthodox group having summer session after summer session and never teaching canon law. We've always taught canon law in the summer session. We think it's just a basic part of what's going on. And you clearly can be a Christian without thinking that. That's to a certain extent cultural. And that's worth thinking about as we end, as thinking about Constantine the Great, Christian legislator. So, thank you.